Ko govorimo o razporeditvi varstvenega dela, recimo moja mama je delala dopoldne, bila je v dopoldanski izmeni, moj oče je bil v popoldanski izmeni. Najprej je hotela ostati doma kot gospodinja, vendar so ji na delu, torej njen šef je strogo zabičal, naj nikakor niti ne pomisli na to. Zato, da bo emancipirana. In zato je določil, če ne morete pač delati popoldne, boste vi delali samo v dopoldanski izmeni, vaš mož pa naj dela v popoldanski. In tako je bilo vsa leta osnovne šole, torej tudi prva leta do petega leta. Torej moj oče me je pazil popoldne, mama pa dopoldne. Imela sem obojestransko vzgojo. To je bilo možno samo zaradi pač tega, ker so upoštevali tudi emancipacijo ženske. Torej, če govorimo o teh kočnih radih. Okay, so I'm going to be I'm going to speak in English now, if you don't mind. Okay? This particular paper consists of 2 parts at least. The first one focuses on the notion, or it actually lays down the groundwork, which is absolutely necessary for the understanding why patriarchy is not a parallel system to capitalism and why it is not accidental to it, but why it is an integral part of it. It is its actual structural feature. So I'm going just to briefly summarize a few points that some of you might be familiar with, but these points need reinstating and re-articulating over and over again. And so we are talking about institutionalized patriarchy, and the second part will have to do with redomestication of care and redomestication of women in the countries that have been neo-colonially annexed to capitalism after 1991. So the first part, which is rather brief, I'm going to read. If I'm going too quickly, let me know. If I say this, it means I'm going to gallop. So capitalism, of course, is directly dependent on patriarchal subordination and gendered exploitation of women. And it is for this reason that capitalism also keeps reinventing patriarchy alongside constructs of femininity and masculinity. And it does this regardless of the different forms that capitalism itself might take. So therefore, always, regardless of the form that capitalism takes, it always rests on the redefinition of social reproductive work as non-work, and as a matter of private and individual concern rather than social and collective responsibility. So this is one of the basic axioms. Accordingly, capitalism has consistently reconceptualized the burden of care for children, and not just for children, but by extension also for the elderly, the sick and the disabled. All of this goes hand in hand. Childcare should never be considered a separate issue. It's always care work that needs to be taken into consideration. So capitalism has consistently reconceptualized the burden of care as something associated solely and entirely with individuals, and more precisely with women, for the reasons that we have already established. So we are talking about philosophical debates that would posit women as others and so on. I don't want to go into that because I've already given a lecture on that, and I don't want to repeat myself on that point. So, within capitalist patriarchal framework, women are posited as a specially designated group of people who should do this kind of work for free, out of love, in the imaginary private sphere of their homes, supposedly as a natural extension of their assigned femininity. So, this kind of redefinition of social reproductive work as women's invisible work and personal service that needs no payment allows capital owners, as we very well know, to transfer and in this way download huge financial costs necessary for the reproduction and maintenance of their own labor force. In other words, this kind of redefinition of social reproductive work as non-work enables capital owners to avoid the issue of the financial input on their side, and in this way it enables them to dispense with huge but essential costs which are necessary for the basic reproduction and regular upkeep of their current and future labor force. To say it again in different terms so that it is finally clear, it means that the downloading of the costs actually in turn translates into a direct increase of their own private wealth or accumulation of capital by means of expropriation. Basically, they do not have to further share the surplus labor created by us, or the fruits of the surplus labor. Okay, as a result, women in capitalism are constructed, regardless of the form it takes. We are not just talking about the traditional breadwinner model whereby the woman supposedly stays at home and the man works. We are talking about different kinds of breadwinner models. But so, in capitalism, women are always constructed primarily as home-confined domestic carers and services. This home confinement has different degrees depending on the mechanisms that are put in place. But women are constructed primarily as home-confined domestic carers and services, and only as secondary workers and secondary earners. And this is the underlying essence of the breadwinner model or patriarchy. Okay? So this means that once women are, by necessity, partially readmitted, they're always partially readmitted to the labour market, paid labour market. Women's work and pay is restructured so that it comes to be regarded not as equal and complementary to that of the male member of the household, but merely supportive and supplementary to it. So women constructed as secondary earners whose income is meant to supplement, not complement, and to support, not to equal the home earnings. So that's why women are paid automatically and substantially less regardless of their actual partner status. For example, American professors at American universities, women professors would be automatically paid up to 25% less for the same kind of work they do. So we're not talking just about, let's say, service sector and so on, even this. So capitalism by default rests on the breadwinner model, regardless of the fact whether women work, because this kind of work is structured so that it is considered supplementary and supportive, but not complementary and equal. So it depends on the breadwinner model, which is patriarchal subordination and gendered exploitation of women. In other words, they impose unpaid reproductive and underpaid productive work essential to the processes of capital accumulation by gendered dispossession. Before we get down to the nuts and bolts, once again, it is important to re-emphasize time and time again that socialism represented an important breakaway from this pattern. It dismantled the institution of the private patriarchy, and what we mean by the private patriarchy is one-to-one economic dependency of women on men. So it did so by granting women the entitlement to a full-time employment on a permanent basis, out of which women, unlike their Western counterparts, could for the first time derive important individually based social rights such as access to social benefits and social security, full health and pension insurance coverage, fully paid maternal and parental leave with accompanying child benefits, and a guarantee of re-employment in the same job position as prior to their maternity leave. Why do I emphasize this? I'm sick and tired of quasi-leftists promoting the Scandinavian model today as the epitome of the social welfare state and, of course, gender equality. That is not even a pale comparison. In Sweden, for example, women at that time had a 45% rate of part-time employment. The breadwinner model was by no means dismantled. It was just reformulated as institutionalized patriarchy, namely, the state would actually, would no longer insist on women staying at home, so they might be admitted to the labor force. But there were such tax incentives in the 1970s, the 1980s, and still in the early 1990s, which would actually say, if the income if the family income is such and such, then of course you are entitled to a tax relief. And the income level would be kept to exactly this calculated degree, which would mean that one of the partners would have to work part-time. So tax relief would be given to families like these. The idea was to encourage partial domestication of care. Okay? So these are small details, but they really change the entire perspective in picture. So bear this in mind as versus socialism. Now, as I have said so many times before, all of this that I have enumerated as the emancipatory benefits for women in socialism, once again, this is something that women in the West could only dream about. So once again, socialism bestowed upon women a full economic and social citizenship, which, coupled as it was with the accompanying individual social and political rights, made it possible for women to also establish and run their own family units independently from men and without risk of poverty. And now compare this to this policy of hatred, whereby single women in the West are usually scapegoated, so to say, which was never ever the case in socialism, because different policies would be used. Okay, so women's access, what is the key now is this: women's access to universally available full-time employment, socioeconomic independence, agency, and full citizenship rested on socializing the costs of reproduction. So childcare and elderly care, not just childcare, but elderly care, and thereby the social reproduction of humanity became a matter of shared public and collective responsibility and state-subsidized policies. Just to remind you, socialist states erected a very extensive, not sporadic, but extensive structural framework to support this emancipation, which was seen in the extensive network of affordable and high-quality public childcare as well as elder care. The facilities included full-time nurseries, kindergartens, and after-school care facilities, and they were topped with affordable school lunches and other social programs, among them also the after-school care. So this is something that, once again, was very rare or non-seen in the West. So just to give you an idea, what I have here is a table which gives you an insight into the provision of public childcare in the Scandinavian countries in 1981 and 1993. Full-time care centers for children, that is creches, for children aged from 0 to 2, so the coverage was 15%. In 1993, it was 18%. Part-time care centers, family daycare centers, or family daycare would actually also prevail. What is meant by this is private nannies or nannies hired by municipalities, but basically working under flexible working conditions. So this would actually mean that access to universal childcare was still restricted. I'm talking about Sweden, by the way, the Scandinavian model. Where am I? Yeah, I really get this, it's this very general approach to the Scandinavian model. Now, once again, so this stood in stark contrast and still does to the so-called Western democracies, which after the Second World War, far from doing away with the breadwinner model, have simply modified and modernized it. And this is primarily due to the absence of or due to the limited and sporadic availability of public childcare facilities. Even though municipalities in the West, for example, would provide for public childcare centers, and even though the statistics might say 65% of children in total cared for, what these statistics hide is, first of all, that these childcare centers would not operate from Monday to Friday, but would be opened on individual days only, so not necessarily 5 days per week. And secondly, that they might be open just for 4 days per day. So what do you do with the remaining 4 hours per day? What do you do with the remaining 4 hours of your working time? So this is what we mean. That's why Western states after the Second World War have upgraded the traditional breadwinner model to the so-called 1.5 breadwinner model, where the woman only precariously and intermittently employed in temporary or part-time jobs. So once again, they would supplement the income of the male member of the household. And in contrast to socialist states, full-time employment and hence socioeconomic independence has been the preserve of only a handful of women in the West. Sweden, Norway, Finland are no exception. 45% rate of women employed on a part-time basis. So all of this has been coupled with very low paid or non-existent maternity and parental leaves. Non-existent maternity, paid maternity and parental leaves. So in this way, Western capitalist states have kept the socioeconomic structures of gendered exploitation, women's systematic subordination, and second-class citizenship very much intact. And in this respect, to talk about neoliberalism as the only curse for women in capitalism is to forget about the continuities between the neoliberal paradigm and the previous periods in the patriarchal history of capitalism. This is a very brief summary of what you already know, and now I'm really starting in earnest. I might explode. So the neo-colonial annexation of former socialist states to the capitalist system has been marked by a process of women's re-domestication and repatriarchalization of society. First of all, as we already know, but I'm going to explain this in detail, it is most clearly evident in the dismantling of the socialist welfare system and its extensive network of high-quality public childcare facilities, alongside with the annulment or reduction of social benefits. And I would like to focus on this category first, either the annulment or the reduction of social benefits concerning maternal and parental leave allowances. Now, wage replacements for maternity and parental leaves for women have been either drastically slashed or restructured in order to minimize or do away with the financial input that would otherwise be required on the part of recently fledged capital owners and employers. So, substantial reduction or elimination of formerly fully paid maternity and parental leaves, of course, works in favor of capital owners, whether these are big corporations or small businesses. Now, what we are witnessing are several different things. First of all, maternity, but more frequently parental leave allowance, is thus either no longer existent in certain countries, post-socialist countries, or it is paid only for a limited period of time. But this, Poland is a typical example of this. But there are 3 other patterns that have been introduced. First of all, paid parental leave allowance is selectively granted on the basis of means tests. It means that it is already selective and exclusionary. And the payment is also flat rate, which means that it falls below subsistence level. This kind of pattern is typical of the so-called liberal residual welfare state, So one type of the so-called social welfare state in capitalism is the liberal residual welfare state. So parental leave is not paid universally. It's not even universally available as a paid leave. It means simply that it would be granted to the poorest among the poor, which is why you need to quantify in terms of your income, and then the rate given is flat. It does not compensate your salary, and it falls below subsistence level. Secondly, the payment can be universally granted, but then it is set only at a certain percentage of a woman's wage, or even average state wage with an upper ceiling. This is typical of the so-called social welfare system in social democracies like Sweden, Finland, and so on. So there is a universal entitlement, but of course there is no full compensation. And the third model is that it can be a combination of a certain percentage of a woman's salary for a few initial months, but then it is followed by a flat rate payment. And this is a typical pattern, it's typical of conservative, cooperative social welfare states in capitalism. The third pattern is something that Croatia has adopted, whereas the second pattern is something that Slovenia is following. But in all cases, we are talking about a substantial reduction in paid parental leave. So in other words, with this reimposition of capitalism, wage replacements for maternal and parental leaves are thus no longer 100%, as in socialism, but amount only to a fraction of a woman's income, as has been the case in Western capitalist countries so far. By the way, the United States has never offered any kind of paid parental leave for women. So this is a typical liberal state. It would offer just poor relief to the lowest paid. Australia, the same case. Now they're trying to change this, but it has been the same case. No paid parental leave or maternal leave for that reason. So what is already in this case, this means that young mothers in post-socialist countries, just like their counterparts in the West, are more and more economically dependent on their wage-earning partners or other family members. If you're left with no income as a mother, I mean, no compensation, paid compensation, you are a dependent person, obviously. Now, alongside this annulment of fully paid parental leaves for women, the installment of capitalism has also resulted, of course, as we very well know, in a complete dismantling or severe retrenchment of public childcare facilities. Now, there have been different approaches used. Now, as a result, the period of parental leave for women, because of the dismantling of this, has been extended up to 3 or 6 years of the child's age, as public childcare facilities have been either entirely eliminated for children up to 3 years old. No public childcare facilities for children up to 3 years old. A very common pattern in Poland nowadays, to a certain extent also in the Czech Republic, and to a certain extent in Hungary, depending on the regions. So this public childcare has been drastically reduced in number, and facilities have only partially been replaced by sporadic private care facilities which charge exorbitant prices. So what is the solution? This has a double negative impact. So on one hand, we have protracted periods of unpaid or no paid parental leave, and a complete lack of, or only a limited provision of publicly funded childcare. And this has a double negative impact on women's socioeconomic and political status. As capitalist regimes, which are based on the privatization of care, place the childcare responsibility squarely on women's shoulders, but at the same time, they also abandon them in the process to scarce or non-existent childcare facilities and other resources, they effectively, structurally, they force women to exit labour markets to tend for children, while perversely presenting this move as their own choice. not as a structurally induced matter, but as a personal choice. So these structural changes enforce and naturalize the position of women as economically dependent partners and carers. At the same time, these childcare regimes also give rise to the feminization of poverty in post-socialist states because they lead to part-time employment patterns or home-based work. Now, obviously, as childcare is redomesticated and women are saddled with full-time childcare duties, they're also rechanneled into the kind of work forms characterized as mommy tracks. And so most recently, I also understand that Croatian officials have made an announcement that in addition to part-time work, they're also introducing home-based work for women in combination. And significantly, these policies have also been accompanied by a seemingly separate, but in reality a related issue, namely the introduction of the institution of private childminders. So home-based work, part-time job, but also the institution of private childminders. So with the reimposition of capitalism, which once again rests on the massive retrenchment of public childcare facilities or their complete dismantling, women are being now structurally tracked into two different categories of newly fledged mothers. On the one hand, that is low-income women, and on the other hand, high-income women. But even though there might appear at first sight, there might appear to be a class difference, basically both categories are saddled with a different set of accompanying minimal benefits and also restricted access to childcare and, of course, mommy job profiles. And it is also at this point that the impact of massively retrenched or completely dismantled public childcare facilities alongside minimal or below minimal wage replacements acquires its full significance. How? As a result of decimated childcare facilities, limited availability of vacancies in the remaining public childcare centres, and significantly raised fees that easily amount to a woman's minimum monthly wage, low-income women are thus structurally induced to take out extended periods of unpaid or no-paid parental leave to take care of children in their homes, while at best seeking part-time or home-based work. The Croatian law, for example, thus stipulates that women who take out a parental leave after the child has turned 6 months can combine it with part-time work. This serves as a preliminary preparation, as we very well know, it serves as a preliminary preparation for low-income women to accept no-paid flexible jobs after the leave in the face of limited or non-existent public childcare facilities. It always starts with a parental leave, and it's very likely to be protracted until the child enters the school. So the benefit, according to the Croatian law, the benefit for the first 6 months officially, or perhaps I can show you this, why would I be shouting at the top of my lungs? This. The benefit for the first 6 months officially amounts to 100% wage replacement, but there is a ceiling imposed. And this means that women in high income brackets, of course, are not fully compensated. More importantly, for the remaining 6 months, the benefit is flat rate and paid at a very low, below subsistence level. And this is another incentive for low-income women to supplement the meager benefit with working part-time. High-income women, on the other hand, are very likely to forego this kind of minimal benefit by returning to work prematurely and having the childcare outsourced to nannies and childminders. This is the point. So parental and possibly protracted, maternal and possibly protracted parental leaves that pay below subsistence level, while they are combined with the possibility of working part-time, of course, are targeted at low-income women, and they function as a structural incentive for them to leave the labour market in the face of limited accessibility and affordability of childcare. And with the introduction of the institution of private childminders, what we are witnessing here is another thing, namely further erosion of already minimalized public childcare. So if no income women are forced to leave the labour market to care for their own children at home and re-enter it primarily as involuntary part-timers or home-based workers, high-income women are encouraged to take on nannies or childminders supposedly as a cheaper, that is, underpaid substitute for formal childcare services. So, it's very important to understand that France and Scandinavia and Italy, but France primarily, it would introduce these measures already in 1982. This is not something that is a matter of the 1990s. It came about in 1982 when France actually reformulated the breadwinner model. Namely, so once again, the idea is that private child care facility, child care institution, the idea is that it still helps to minimally sustain upper income women's full-time employment, but at the expense of undoing or further depressing and keeping public child care facilities at the minimum. So the state would offer tax deductions or direct subsidies that would cover a portion of the childminder's pay, and in this case, the capitalist state provides minimal amounts of money, which of course in turn serves as an incentive for high-income women to hire a self-employed private nanny. Now, the practice in the West shows that capitalist state gives out minimal cash supports to high-income parents so that they can hire live-in nannies, that is, childminders that live in the children's home and do not need to be necessarily licensed or qualified, or the subsidies are given to middle-income parents to hire registered childminders that care for children in their own homes. So we have two categories. Registered childminders that would actually be invited, in inverted commas, invited to live or to stay with the families, or they would actually be, they could actually take children into their own homes. So whichever option is used, it works to the detriment of the public care. The aim of these policies is to increase what is in fact only minimal spending on subsidies or minimal cash transfers, while further decreasing the spending for public childcare. Now, even though it might seem that these arrangements work in favor of higher income women, the minuscule provisions that are meted out in the form of tax deductions or subsidies, this still means that most of care provision costs are still downloaded onto the households themselves. And this is another form of disinvestment on the part of capital owners in social reproduction, while the minimum cash incentives represent a form of cooptation. In other words, for capital owners, childcare provided by stay-at-home parents or by childminders is cheaper than care provided by professionals in creches and age-integrated child centres. Institutional care is considered too costly compared to family-based childcare, mainly because of the higher quality of services required, also in higher quantities in terms of facilities, number of qualified employees, and higher wages. So childcare reforms that rest on the promotion of self-employed childminders aim towards the cheapening, deprofessionalization and flexibilization of childcare labour, especially as women workers are forced out of the public childcare sector and channeled instead into private semi-formal employment schemes. I would like us to take a look at what this actually means in practice rather than me just perhaps theorizing. This is what I saw in Zagreb a few months ago, and it says, excuse my creation, specijalizirana agencija za pomoć u domaćinstvu, čuvanje djece, pomoć u kući, pomoć starijima, mali kućni popravci. So, if we move on, we see what this means. So, flexibilization, underpayment, all-inclusive household work. This is what the experiences of the first private childminders say. kuhala bih im ručak i radila razne kućanske poslove. Problem je bio u tome što je moj opis posla bio fleksibilan. Što god bih napravila po kući, oprala, skuhala, peglala, moji poslodavci su smatrali da to nije dovoljno. Htjeli su da budem još fleksibilnija. U Zagrebu radi nekoliko agencija za posredovanje. Sve ostalo od plaće do uvjeta rada stvar je dogovora između dadilje i roditelja. So these childminders are taken out of the public child care system, so out of the collective agreements, and this of course flexibilizes them. But also, another thing, look at this. Nikada nisam imala problema ni sa jednim roditeljem, osim sa jednom mamom koja je bila divna i krasna, sve dok jednom nisam zamolila za slobodan petak jer sam morala ići na vjenčanje. Prvo je pristala, a poslije zamjerila pa sam dala otkaz. Ampak, pogledajte še to. This is a typical situation in Ireland. It has been a typical situation for several decades now. So Florence she's a private employer. Well, what made me very cross when I actually got her, she wanted to be paid for holidays, but I said no. She was quite demanding about being paid for holidays, but I don't know. I feel it's dreadful to be paying 140 quid when you don't have to. But Florence, she works in the public sector. Florence is paid holiday pay by her employer in the formal sector of economy, but would not transfer the same entitlement she enjoys to the childminder. So this is what we mean by the privatization, by the private childminder institute. So private semi-formal employment schemes with individual families as new employers and therefore direct exploiters. Child-minding jobs conducted in the privacy of households, be those of private employers or the childminders, are marked by little or no job protection, as you can see. They are non-standard part-time or temporary jobs with payment that falls below minimum wage threshold. They offer little or no social benefits. For example, dadilja koja čuva 5 djece i bruto zaradi najviše 5.000 kuna, teško može izdvojiti pola toga iznosa za poreze i doprinose. So the common practice in the West, in France, for example, it has been that, for example, in France, women cannot pay insurance contributions or very little insurance contributions. So in France, for example, they still have to rely, and this is institutionally allowed, they have to rely on the male breadwinner for social rights such as pension or sickness benefits. So in other words, they derive these from their partners once they die or retire. So in addition to that, once childminders are confined to the private sphere, childminders are no longer regarded as professionals that need training, which leads to the workers' deprofessionalization and de-skilling. And this in turn further depresses women's wages as they are no longer considered trained individuals, but many women doing supposedly women's work that should come to them naturally and which consequently no longer requires adequate and full remuneration. In other words, this is what is happening, de-skilling. How is this taking place? Among other things, you don't need to do 4 years of a secondary school as a child trainer or as a childminder, for example. It's enough for you to do a crash course, which takes altogether 2.5 months. And this, of course, is something that is encouraged by the European Union. In other words, this would result in greater underpayment. It's quite clear. And this is what detraining, deprofessionalization, and de-skilling actually means in practice. And here we have a turn to high conservatism. No, meni je kao majci bilo daleko važnije da je dadilja dobra osoba, puna ljubavi, da ima vlastito majčinsko iskustvo i da fino kuha nego da ima završenu pedagošku školu ili tečaj. Nema škole za dadilju, žena to mora osjećati u sebi. So we are talking, this is also socially enforced repatriarchalization. It's about essentialization and it's about childcare, it's about, once again, this is not something that you learn. It's not about training. It's not about knowledge. It's not about knowledge acquisition. It's something that supposedly resides in you as a woman because supposedly you're closer to nature, which is nonsense. But this is what the employers would also think, namely, in order to justify the no wages just as well. And this really crowns it all. Roditelji rade u smjenama, a ona ne pita za radno vrijeme, voli ih kao svoju obitelj. Mjesečno je plaćaju 2800 kuna, to je 400 euro, če se ne motim. I s tim je zadovoljna. Premda joj ističe, novac nije jedini motiv da čuva djecu, ona u tome jednostavno uživa, jer ona je žena. So, as families become private employers, subsidized by the capitalist state, the cost of childcare are not only downloaded and the childcare redomesticated, but this once again becomes invisible work. It becomes invisible work. It is also that individual families as new employers become the direct exploiters of childminders, no longer protected by collective agreements. So that's why we shouldn't forget the heritage of socialism, what heritage did. It qualified women, even though women might have been channeled into childcare jobs, but they would be given qualifications, they would be given full-time jobs, they would be given social security, social pensions, because this was considered a profession. It was not considered an extension of women's work. It was considered to be a trained, qualified job. And anybody who had the qualification, the training could do it, including men. Now, with this kind of redomestication, this is becoming more like women's work and exclusively women's work. So capitalism, I have now left out many things. Capitalism as a system, so this is what we have to keep in mind. Capitalism as a system, regardless of the shapes it has taken, has always been dependent in its expropriation and increased accumulation of the private wealth of the few upon the individualization and therefore privatization, and that is, in other words, domestication of care. In other words, it has always been dependent upon gendered exploitation and institutionalized patriarchy. This is part and parcel of institutionalized patriarchy. As a childminder, as a private childminder, you still depend on your social benefits on your partner in the household, even though you work like 40 years. So, it has always been dependent upon gendered expectation, institutionalized patriarchy, with a heavy emphasis on the breadwinner model, which it continues to renew and reinforce on a regular basis by giving it different structural supports and therefore new faces. And that's why an isolated focus on neoliberalism results in a restricted view of capitalism, because it pushes from view precisely this kind of systemic understanding. For neoliberalism, too, rests on the reconfiguration of the breadwinner model and restructuration of the domestication of care rather than its abandonment. Pension credits for the housewives are a typical example of this. This is where neoliberalism comes in. It doesn't train women, it doesn't qualify them, it doesn't give them full-time jobs, it doesn't say you have the same social benefits and social rights. You might have pension credits if you live to see them. So this is what we call deferred, postponed, below subsistence payment. Once again, I would just like to draw attention to this. So neoliberalism is not a deviation from the capitalist patriarchy's norm. The approach might be different, but the end results are the same. Despite different approaches, the aim of these two seemingly different versions of capitalism has always been and remains the same: disinvestment from public childcare facilities. And what was unique to socialism, disinvestment from formalized, high-quality and equity-waged collective caring work in favor of redomestication and privatization of childcare. So on the one hand, and this is where I conclude, a narrow focus on neoliberalism therefore obscures the continuities in capitalism, and in this way, inhibits the understanding of the mechanisms and structuration of capitalist patriarchy in general. It averts our critical gaze from previous eras of capitalism, rendering them opaque and, in retrospect, even seemingly harmless. In this way, it leads to a false premise that the restoration of the old capitalist order would bring about an instant form of self-restoration. And so, it drops from view, what really drops from view completely is exactly what should be the central and life-saving question, if not our preoccupation, namely, that the variegated possibilities of being and self-realization of women that capitalism restricts and destroys, while socialism, with its connective and universally covered and socialized childcare, enables. And I would like to finish on this point.